What is the difference between e-cigarette vaping and cigarette smoking? This is a question that I get asked a lot of times. Now, my name is Dr. Felix Effa. I'm a neuropharmacologist and a toxicologist. Today, I will talk to you about what is the difference between e-cigarette and tobacco smoking. Now, there is a consensus, sometimes, of course, malinformed, that e-cigarettes are worse or similar to cigarette smoking. And as a toxicologist who has done a lot of research on e-cigarette and their toxic effect on the human lungs, this is not true. E-cigarettes are, of course, not harmless. When I say safer alternative to cigarette, it means that when you compare e-cigarette to cigarette smoking, they do not cause as much damage to the lungs or to health as the cigarette would do. So they are safer, but they are not harmless. Now, when you compare a person who does not do e-cigarette or does not vape, their health conditions will be better than a person who vapes. But if you asked me to choose between e-cigarette and cigarette, right, for a person who is a smoker who wants to now get their nicotine surge without having all the toxicants in cigarette, I would say go for the e-cigarette, because in fact literature has shown that e-cigarette contain fewer chemicals that are toxic for the human body compared to cigarette, and also it does not have all the tar that is in cigarette smoke, right? So relatively safer than cigarette. Now let's look at the other down parts of e-cigarette. The problem is that there have been instances where illegal e-cigarette bars have been sold to younger children. Now that is the problem. If you see a kid with e-cigarette, you may not necessarily pay attention to that because you may not even notice that they are vaping. But if you see a kid with cigarette, then you will be, of course, alarmed. So these kids are vaping in schools. They are vaping. It's a nice, fancy device. So they can even hide it in their jumpers and cardigans, and they can be vaping it in class. I think that's the downside of it. And also, because they are not at a legal age to go and purchase them in the shops, they have been getting it from illegal sources, which may not necessarily meet the standards of the commercially available e-cigarette devices. So they may have high levels of heavy metals like chromium, mercury, cadmium, and all these bad heavy metals that would, of course, interfere with kids' brains. And these kids are still developing, their brains are still developing, so it can interfere with their cognitive abilities. Now, these are the downside of it. There's also another downside that people who are against e-cigarette and pro-cigarette smoking say that, oh, the flavors in e-cigarette, they may be very harmful compared to cigarette smoking. And I said no, because think about this. Even though e-cigarette vaping contain chemicals that may potentially be toxic, it is nowhere comparable to the cigarette smoke. Cigarette smoke has about 8,000 chemicals, whereas e-cigarette have less, significantly less than that. I think something in the hundreds, right? And of course, when you have flavors that are meant to be eaten being thermally degraded and inhaled in the lungs, you may potentially have certain toxicants, chemicals that are not meant to be in the lungs being there, right? But of course, I would advise anybody who was a smoker in the past to switch if they want to get an improvement in their health. But do not think that it is harmless. We are not talking about harmless here. We're talking about harm reduction, not harm prevention, right? But for kids who have never smoked, who are naive smokers, I do not advise anyone to pick up an e-cigarette device or e-cigarette vape. This is because when you're hooked on nicotine, nicotine is one of the most addictive substances in the world. It is the fifth most addictive substance. And so when you're hooked on nicotine, the chances are you're going to be hooked on it for the rest of your life. And it's an expensive addiction. So I hope this answers your question between the side effect or the harmful effect of cigarette and e-cigarette. And there's a wide literature backing this claim, right? Thank you very much for watching this video. If you like the information that I shared with you, consider subscribing. My name is Dr. Felix. See you soon.